I had just turned brisk toward the far end of the pasture when he stopped dead ears, stiff head turning toward the gulch. A sound carried up from below. Ragged, shallow nothing like the cry of a coyote. The sun was sitting high, throwing hard light into every crease of the land. And for a moment I thought my eyes had caught on a shadow that didn't belong. Then I saw her half covered in dust clothes, torn arms stretched limply over the dirt. Even from the saddle I could see the crusted blood, the dark bindings where her legs should have been. Brisk shifted under me, and I knew if I rode on, that sound would be gone before sundown. Before I tell you what came of that, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a choice you couldn't take back. My name's Wade Holt. I was born in Missouri, worked my father's fields from the time I could hold a hoe. We didn't have much, but my folks believed in keeping our word, helping a neighbor when trouble came, and resting on the Lord's day, no matter how many chores waited. The war came when I was barely grown, and like too many boys, I went where I was told wearing a uniform for a cause I didn't much believe in. I came back with a limp, a few scars, and the feeling that noise and crowds had nothing left to offer me. After drifting between cattle drives, a short spell in a mining camp, and work no one remembers, I bought a stretch of dry land in the Arizona Territory. The soil was poor, the wind hard, but it was mine. I built a cabin from split pine, patched the gaps with iron sheeting, and set about living quiet. Folks in Copper Ridge said I kept to myself because of the fire, the one that took my wife 3 winters back while I was out mending a fence. Maybe they were right. After that, my world got smaller. Days were measured in fence lines, walked stock-counted wood, split before the sun dipped low. Out here, the nearest town's half a day's ride. Most weeks, I don't see another face unless I ride in for salt or flour. The land's ruled by its own laws, heat that can kill a man, by noon rains that vanish for months, and folks who will take what they can if they think you're too slow to stop them. The railroads are pushing closer each season, and with them come speculators, marshals, and others with papers in their pockets that can strip a man of his land as quick as a hard winter. I've seen neighbors lose everything over debts they didn't know they had. It was in that kind of country, on a morning baked in dust, that I found the tracks leading toward the ravine. I'd been following 3 stray heifers, thinking more about mending the north fence than anything else. The trail wound down into shadows, and that's where I saw her. She didn't move when I called out, just lay still, the wind catching at her torn dress. I could tell she was Apache, could see the sharp lines of her face beneath the dirt. The air hung heavy between us, carrying no sound but Brisk's slow breathing. I dismounted, my boots scuffing the edge of the slope, and for a moment I just stood there looking down. If I left her, the sun would finish what the blast had started. If I took her, trouble could follow me straight to my own door. My hand rested on the butt of my revolver without thinking, but I didn't draw it. Instead, I took a step closer, and her eyes opened just enough to meet mine. I slid down the slope, one careful step at a time, dust shifting under my boots, the heat pressing against my back. Up close, I could see how much she'd bled. The cloth wrapped around her thighs was dark and stiff, knotted in a way that told me it had been done in a hurry. Her face was drawn tight, eyes nearly shut, lips split from sun and thirst. She didn't say a word, just watched me like she was weighing something. The air down in the ravine was still. Even the flies seemed to hover without moving. I took my hat off and glanced along the ridge. No other riders, no sign of a camp, nothing but rock and brush in every direction. If I left her, the sun would finish what the blast had started. If I took her, there'd be questions I didn't care to answer. Still, I bent down, slipped an arm under her shoulders and another where her knees should have been, and lifted. She made a sound, low and broken, but didn't fight me. Brisk stood steady as I swung into the saddle with her in my arms. The ride back felt longer than it should have, the sun beating on my neck, the leather creaking under us. She didn't lean into me or try to speak, just kept her head turned enough to watch the land slide past. When the cabin came into view, the wind picked up, pushing dust against the porch and rattling the loose edge of the roof tin. Inside, the air was cooler, but carried the scent of old wood smoke. I set her down on the cot, the only bed I had, and fetched water from the barrel. She followed me with her eyes while I stoked the small stove, boiled a cloth, and cut strips from an old sheet. The binding she'd been left with had stuck to the wounds. I loosened them slow, the way you'd ease a splinter out of a child's finger. She tensed, but stayed silent. The stumps were angry red, swollen, the skin split in places. I cleaned them with boiled water and pine sap, packed what I could, then wrapped them fresh. My hands were used to fence wire and leather work, but I kept them steady. When I finished, she lay back, her gaze shifting to the rafters. By the time I hung the kettle back on its hook, she'd closed her eyes. I didn't sleep much that night. Sat at the table, boots on the floor, listening to her breathe. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and every now and then a coyote called from the ridge. Near dawn, she stirred. The first light fell across the floor, and she looked around the room as if to place herself in it. Her hand drifted to where her legs had been stopping short when she found only the blanket. Her throat moved like she was swallowing back something. I stepped inside with a bowl bread soaked in broth and set it on the crate beside her. She didn't take it right away, just looked at me. "Silent man." She rasped the words rough, like they'd been hauled over gravel. I didn't answer, just stepped back toward the door. The wind outside caught the edge of the barn roof, making it groan. Later that morning, I found her propped against the wall, the blanket folded over her lap. Her eyes tracked me as I brought in an armload of kindling. She tried to shift herself upright and winced. I set the wood down and crouched beside her. "You'll tear your stitches," I said. She met my eyes for a moment, then let me ease her back. There was strength in her grip even now. In the shed, I found the frame of an old chair I'd cut down from my bad hip. By lamplight, I worked it into a rolling platform, low to the ground, padded with cloth rails on either side. The wheels came off a cart that hadn't run right in years. I pressed my weight on it to test the frame, listened for any groan or give. When I brought it in the next morning, she just stared at it. After a long moment, her fingers brushed the edge. "You made this?" I shrugged. "I don't beg," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You didn't." By midday, she was learning to use it. I showed her how to brace against the doorframe pivot by pulling on the rail. She cursed under her breath when the wheels caught on a crack in the floor, but she kept trying. Sweat rolled down her temple, and she brushed it away with the back of her hand before pushing again. I didn't hover, just stayed close enough in case she slipped. That night, while I lit the lamp, she asked, "You got a name, Silent Man?" I paused with one hand on the door. "Wade," I said. She repeated it under her breath once, then let it go. Her eyes followed me as I stepped outside to check the sky. The wind had died and the air was cooling. In the days that followed, she kept to the platform, moving from stove to table to window. Her palms blistered from the work, and she didn't complain. She wore one of my old shirts after her dress tore beyond mending, cinched at the waist with a strip of cloth. I left it folded at the foot of the cot without a word, and she put it on the next morning. One evening, she asked if I'd fought. I told her, Missouri Battalion, Confederate side. She studied me for a long moment. "And now you help me," she said. I didn't answer right away. "War's done," I said, finally. That was the end of it. 2 days later, she woke with fever. By nightfall, her skin was hot and damp, her lips cracked. I boiled willow bark, lifted her head, and made her drink. She turned away once, but I steadied her until she swallowed. Through the night, she murmured words I didn't understand, one name more than once, Tana. By morning, the fever had broken. Her eyes opened slow. "You stayed," she said. I nodded. "You're still here." The wind shifted that day, carrying the dry smell of mesquite through the open window. She moved her platform closer to it, breathing in the air. I fixed the latch on the back door, keeping my tools close. Something in her face had changed since the fever, not softer, but clearer, like she'd decided on something. We ate late, the lamp throwing a circle of light on the table. She didn't speak much, and neither did I. Outside the ridge lay dark, no firelight, no riders. Still, I checked my rifle before setting it near the door. By the time I turned back, she'd wheeled herself toward the cot blanket already across her lap. She glanced at me once before settling in, and there was something in that look that told me the quiet wouldn't last. By the end of the first week, Sokka could roll herself from one end of the cabin to the other without asking for help. The blisters on her hands had turned to calluses, her arms working harder now than they ever had before. She learned to pivot near the table brace against the stove and stop the wheels from drifting on the uneven boards. Some mornings, she rose before me already dressed in my old shirt, cinched at the waist with a strip of hide. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice was steady. She asked how far it was to Copper Ridge, how many cattle I kept, how often strangers came this way. I answered plain, never adding more than she asked. Sometimes she'd stop working the wheels and just sit in the light near the window, staring out at the ridge like she could read the land from here. One afternoon, I was patching a saddle near the barn door. When she asked about my wife, I kept my eyes on the leather, running the needle through. Fire, I said. 3 winters ago. Stove tipped while I was fixing the fence. I got back too late. She didn't press for more. The silence that followed wasn't sharp, just heavy enough to settle between us. That evening, I brought a second chair to the table. She gave me a look as I set it down beside hers. "You going to sit with me now?" she asked. I nodded once. We ate together without the table between us, the lamp in the middle throwing shadows along the walls. She chewed, slow eyes flicking toward me now and then. When the plates were cleared, she asked to be taken outside. "There's no one out there," she said when I hesitated. "I just want the wind." I lifted her and stepped onto the porch. The sun was folding into the hills, streaks of orange and purple across the sky. She closed her eyes, breathed in, and said it smelled like fire somewhere far off. We sat there until the light was gone, her shoulder brushing mine, not by accident. After that evening, the space between us felt different. She didn't pull the blanket so high when she lay down. She looked me square in the eye when I moved her from the chair to the cot. "You ain't scared of me," she said once. "No," I told her. She waited a moment. Why, I said because she was alive, and she gave a slow nod, before turning away with the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. The days grew warmer, the air dry and filled with the smell of mesquite. She moved with more control in the chair now, never wincing when she pulled herself across the floor. The calluses on her palms were thick, and she didn't seem to notice them anymore. I found her one morning sewing a strip of leather into a belt, the needle flashing quick in her hands. We were outside mending the back gate when she spotted the rider. She was near the chicken coop, the sun behind her, and her voice carried across the yard. "Someone's coming." I straightened, wiped my hands on my trousers, and stepped inside for my rifle. She rolled behind the porch wall, her hand slipping under the blanket, where the knife I'd given her was tied to the chair frame. The rider came alone on a mule-thin man in a long coat hat, low over his eyes. He raised a hand as he neared the fence. I stood in the open, rifle low. "Marshal's office sent me," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Looking for reports of movement east of the gulch. Cavalry spooked a few settlers." The paper bore a seal and a name, J. "Mallory Marshall." "You live out here alone?" he asked, glancing toward the barn. "Quiet suits me," I said. He squinted toward the coop, but I didn't shift my stance. "Chickens," I told him before he could ask. He tipped his hat, told me to send word if I saw anything, and rode back the way he'd come. When the dust from his mule settled, Sokka rolled out from behind the wall. He saw something, she said. Not today, I told her. She didn't look convinced. That night she stayed up later than usual, working thin strips of leather into a braided sling. For the knife, she said, when she caught me watching. I didn't argue. 2 days later, she rolled up behind me while I was clearing the table and caught my arm. I turned and she pulled me down to her. Her lips were warm, steady. When we broke apart, she said, "You don't need to fix me." I told her I wasn't trying. "Good," she said, "because I'm not going anywhere." That night we lay together again, slower this time. She guided my hands where she could still feel the nerves pressed against me like she had all her strength back. Afterward, she rested her head on my chest. "You ever want children?" she asked. I told her I had a daughter once, before the fire. She was 2. Sokka didn't speak, just laced her fingers with mine. "I can't," she said quietly. I told her she was still everything. The next morning, she carved a small bead from bone and handed it to me. "It means day," she said. I kept it in my pocket. By then, the heat had deepened, cicadas loud in the brush. The land outside the cabin held that pale, brittle look, like it might crack underfoot. We worked early and late, keeping to the shade in between. One quiet morning, the sound of hooves came fast up the trail. I was behind the barn, pulling weeds from the fence post, Sokka at the stove. She rolled to the doorway as the rider pulled up a man on a brown gelding boots, 2 clean pistol on one hip, knife on the other. He scanned the cabin like he already knew what was inside. "Who's asking?" Sokka called, her hand slipping under the blanket. "Name's Harlan," he said. "Came from Yuma. Heard about a wounded Apache woman left behind near Copper Ridge. Word is there's a bounty." I stepped from the side of the house with the rifle in my hands. "It ain't true," I said. Harlan's hand drifted toward his belt. "She's under my roof," I told him. "She stays." He looked between us, weighing his chances, then pulled the reins and turned the gelding. "Ain't nothing here worth dying over," he said, riding off. We watched the dust trail fade. Sokka's jaw was set when she spoke. "They'll send someone worse." After Harlan's visit, the air around the cabin felt different. The hills looked the same, the wind moved through the brush the same. But both of us kept glancing toward the trail without meaning to. The next morning, I tightened the hinges on the barn door and checked the rifle twice before setting it back near the table. Sokka stayed close to the porch, a blanket over her lap, her eyes fixed east. She hadn't said much since Harlan rode off, but she didn't have to. We both knew he'd be talking to someone by now. That afternoon, I sat beside her at the table. "If they come back, they might bring paper," I said. "Orders, maybe soldiers?" She didn't blink. "I'm not running." I told her they'd call her a fugitive. She met my eyes. I was already left for dead. "I'm not leaving again." I didn't press it further. When the sun dipped low, we moved supplies into the corner by the trap door. I'd built the space months back, big enough for a rifle, food, and a body or 2, if it came to that. She traced the edge of the opening with her fingers. "You made this for me?" she asked. I nodded. "After the fever." She was quiet a long moment before leaning in and kissing me slow. When she pulled back, her hand stayed on my cheek. "I'll kill for this place," she said. "I already have," I told her. The following days were a stretch of waiting. We didn't speak much about it, but it was in every movement, the way she kept her knife within reach, the way I stacked wood closer to the back door. On the second night, she sat in her chair sewing a wide sash from the hem of one of my old shirts. When it was done, she'd stitched a single word into it with black thread. Still, she tied it across her chest, scars and all like armor. By the 3rd day, neither of us was sleeping well. I found her in the dark, rolling her chair back and forth across the cabin floor. "You need rest," I said. She didn't stop moving. "I'll rest when I see their faces." She looked up, then steady. "You know what scares them, that I'm not alone." The next morning, the sound of hooves came from the trail. Not Harlan. 2 riders this time, both in military coats. One dismounted, while the other stayed mounted at the fence. The man on the ground called out my name, said they were looking for a native woman named Saka, considered absconded from lawful detainment after fighting U.S. military forces. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, but pointed down. "She's not here," I said. He pulled a folded document from his coat. Orders from the Arizona Territorial Marshal. I asked if he had a warrant. He repeated the paper's authority, but I didn't step aside until he moved toward the cabin. Inside, Saka was already under the trap door, lying still in the dark. Boots crossed the floor above her head, boards creaked, the barn door opened and shut. They never touched the rug over the hatch. When they left, the taller one turned back. "You sure no one's been by?" "We've had sightings down this trail." I told him I hadn't seen anyone. We watched them ride off until they were only a dust cloud in the distance. An hour later, I pulled the trapdoor up. Saka was sweating, covered in straw and dirt. I reached down and lifted her out. She held on longer than usual before letting go. "I'm tired of being hunted," she said once she had water in her hand. I told her they'd come again and we'd be ready. That evening, she cut the hem off another one of my shirts and began sewing again. The wind had picked up outside, tapping the shutters against the wall. That night, she didn't wait for me to ask. She came to the cot, pressed against me under the blanket, her mouth warm on my throat. "I want you," she said. "Not to forget, not to feel better. Just because I want you." She climbed into my lap with effort, her arms strong, her body scarred but sure. I held her waist steady as she moved against me. We didn't speak much, only when I told her she was mine. She looked me in the eye and said she'd been mine since the day I carried her from the dirt. We fell asleep with her hand on my chest, my fingers laced through hers. The last thing I remember was the sound of the wind moving over the roof. By morning, the trail was empty again, but the waiting hadn't ended. The 4th morning after the soldiers left, Saka was on the porch before the sun cleared the ridge. She sat wrapped in the heavy woven blanket she favored, eyes scanning the valley. The light was pale, the kind that makes shadows stretch long before the day truly starts. No riders, no dust trails, just the stillness that comes before heat settles in. When I stepped out, she turned her head. "You heard anything?" I asked. She shook her head. "Nothing but wind." I looked at her the way the early light caught the scar on her cheek, the way her eyes held steady. She said they weren't coming back, and I didn't argue. That afternoon, I hitched brisk to the wagon and laid a thick bed of blankets in the back. "We're going past the North Ridge," I told her. She braced her hands on the edge and hauled herself up with effort, her jaw set against the strain. When she was settled, I climbed onto the seat and flicked the reins. We rode in silence, the wagon creaking as it rolled over dry ground. At the creek bed, I stopped. The cottonwood there leaned crooked over the water, its shade cool and deep. I carried her down and set her on the grass. "I used to bring my daughter here," I said. "She liked to watch the frogs." "You never told me her name," she said. "Mara," I answered. She never caught a frog, but she tried. Saka gave the faintest smile. "She sounds like someone I'd have liked." I told her she might have scared her. "Only a little," she said. We sat under that tree a long while, listening to the water move over stones. She leaned against my side. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what comes next." I waited. I want more than surviving. I want to build something with you. Real. Her words hung in the air between us. I told her I'd thought the same every day since I met her. She reached into the small leather pouch at her belt and pulled out a carved bone ring. It wasn't perfect. The edge was uneven, but it was strong. "You took me in when I was nothing but blood and bone." That's more than most men do for a wife. I slipped the ring onto my finger. Then I guess I'm her husband now, I said. You always were, she replied. We stayed by the creek until the sun started to sink, then I carried her back to the wagon. That evening she made cornbread for the first time. The edges burned and she muttered under her breath in her own tongue, but I ate every bite. Best bread I've had in years, I told her. She narrowed her eyes, but there was a smile in it. Later I lifted her into the cot, same as always. This time she pulled me down beside her before I could step back. You're not sleeping in that chair again, she said. We lay with the blankets tangled around us, her fingers tracing slow over my chest. You miss the old life, she asked. I told her no, not even before the war. The only thing I missed was what I never had. Like what she asked, I met her eyes, like this. She leaned in her lips, brushing my shoulder. It's yours now, she said. The next morning, the ranch looked the same, the wind moving over the grass, the chickens scratching in the dirt, but something in the air felt settled. For the first time in a long while, I knew we'd woken to a life we'd chosen, not just endured. By late June, the ridge and flats around the ranch baked under a hard sky. Water in the barrels dropped lower each day, and the smell of mesquite hung in the still air. We kept the work to early mornings and late evenings, leaving the heat of midday for the shade of the cabin. Saka had the layout of the place memorized, rolling to the stove, the table, the porch, without hesitation. The ramp out back had worn grooves where her wheels passed daily. One afternoon, while I was checking the north fence, she called from the porch. Rider coming, she said, her voice low, but steady. I crossed the yard to stand beside her. A single figure moved along the east trail, dust rising behind him. We waited until the shape took form, a man in a dark coat not wearing army blue, but not dressed like a ranch hand either. He stopped a short distance from the porch. Looking for Wade Holt, he said. I stayed where I was. You found him. He nodded once. Name's Dwyer. Deputy out of Copper Ridge. Got word about strangers moving through, thought you might have seen something. His eyes drifted past me toward the porch. Saka sat still, hands folded in her lap. Can't say I have, I told him. He asked a few more questions, but I gave him nothing to work with. When he left, Saka watched until he was a speck on the trail. He was looking at me, she said. I told her I'd seen it too. That night we double-checked the cellar beneath the floor. The food and water would hold for several days if needed, and the oil lamps were filled. Saka's knife was kept tied against the chair frame where she could reach it quick. We didn't talk about running, neither of us intended to. The following morning I worked in the barn while she sat in the shade near the chicken coop. She was braiding strips of leather again this time, looping them into a wide band she could tie across her chest. Easier to carry the knife like this, she said when I walked over. I nodded, knowing it was more than practicality, it was a statement. That evening the wind turned, carrying grit from the flats. The shutters rattled, and the sky took on that yellow tint that comes before a storm. We ate in near silence, the lamp's light swaying with each gust. She glanced at me once, then said, If they come again, I don't want to hide. I told her hiding kept her alive. She shook her head. Alive isn't enough anymore. The next day passed without sign of riders. We fixed a loose board on the corral and hauled water from the creek. That night she rolled close to the cot and pulled herself up beside me. There was no hesitation in her touch, no question in her eyes. We lay together long after the lamp burned out, her breath warm against my chest. The following morning broke quiet. The storm had blown itself out, leaving the air cooler. I was mending a bridle strap when the sound of hooves reached the porch. 2 men this time, their coats marked with army insignia. One stayed mounted while the other stepped forward, a folded paper in his hand. Territorial orders to search the premises, he said. Saka had already wheeled herself to the trap door. I lifted the rug and helped her down, closing it just as Boots crossed the threshold. They looked through the cabin, stepped into the barn, even walked the perimeter of the corral. But they didn't find her. The man on the porch asked if I'd seen anyone matching her description. I told him no. When they were gone, I waited until the dust from their horses had settled before lifting the trap door. She came up covered in straw, her hands gripping mine harder than usual. "They're getting closer," she said. I nodded. "We'll be ready." That night, the air between us felt charged. She came to the cot without a word, slid under the blanket, and rested her forehead against mine. "Whatever happens," she said, "we face it together." I told her that was the only way. We lay awake listening to the wind until it carried us into sleep. The air turned brittle that morning, the kind that made every sound carry across the flats. Sokka was mending a shirt on the porch, while I checked the harness straps in the barn. Around mid-morning, the sound of hooves reached from the east trail. Not the slow, wandering pace of a neighbor, this was steady, deliberate. I stepped into the yard, wiping my hands on my trousers. 4 riders approached, all in matching coats. 2 bore the territorial insignia, 1 wore a wide-brimmed black hat, and the last, a tall man with a thick mustache, carried himself like he was in charge. They stopped a few yards from the porch. "You Wade Holt?" the man in the hat asked. I nodded once. "Name's Marshal Silas Kettering. We're here on orders to take into custody an Apache woman matching a certain description. We have reason to believe she's here." Sokka didn't move her hands, resting in her lap, the needle and thread lying still. I told him there was no one here fitting that description. His gaze slid past me toward her. "Mind if we have a look around? You've already been here before," I said, keeping my voice even. Nothing's changed. Kettering swung down from his horse boots, thudding against the packed dirt. "The difference this time," he said, "is I've got authority from the territorial judge." He held out a paper with a heavy seal pressed into it. They searched with a precision that told me this wasn't their first hunt. 2 men moved through the cabin, tapping floorboards with their boots. Another checked the barn-rattling feed barrels. I stood near Sokka, ready if they tried to take her by force. When one of them reached for her chair, I stepped forward. "She's under my protection," I said. Kettering's mouth twitched. "Protection won't matter much when a warrant says otherwise." He looked at her directly. "You know your people left you to die. You think this rancher's going to stop what's coming?" Sokka met his stare without flinching. "I've stopped worse," she said. Her voice was low, but every man on the porch heard it. Kettering hesitated, then signaled his men. "We'll be back," he said. They rode off, dust curling behind them. That evening, the wind came down off the ridge sharp enough to lift the edge of the roof shingles. We brought the horses into the barn and lit 2 lamps inside their glow, throwing long shadows over the stalls. Sokka sat in her chair, cleaning her knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "They'll try again," she said. I told her we'd be ready. We worked through the night, securing the trapdoor and setting a second hiding place in the barn loft, just in case. She tested the rig herself, using a length of rope to pull the chair up part way before I lifted her the rest. It was slow, but it would do if we had to move quick. 3 days later, a rider came at dusk. Not Kettering, but Deputy Dwyer. He dismounted without a word, eyes darting toward the barn. "They're planning to come at first light," he said quietly. "Not with 4 men this time, with 12. He didn't stay long. After he left, Sokka and I sat in the lamplight, the silence between us heavier than any words. She reached across the table and took my hand. "If it comes to it," she said, "don't let them take me alive." I squeezed her fingers, unable to promise anything, but knowing I would do whatever was needed. We spent the rest of the night preparing not just for hiding, but for a stand, I moved the rifle to the front window and laid extra rounds on the sill. She tied the leather band across her chest, the knife handle resting just under her arm. The night air grew colder, but neither of us felt it. By the time the first rim of sunlight touched the ridge, we were ready. The sound of hooves came as a low rumble growing until it filled the morning. Sokka sat in her chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the trail. I stood beside her, watching the dust rise higher. The riders came fast out of the morning light, their silhouettes sharp against the ridge. 12 in all, just like Deputy Dwyer warned. Marshal Kettering rode at the front, his black hat pulled, low eyes fixed on the cabin. Sokka sat steady in her chair by the window, rifle across her lap. I stood beside her, every sense tuned to the moment. The first crack of gunfire split the air, echoing against the hills. I answered with a single shot, the sound deep and final. The men fanned out, some taking cover behind the corral, others edging toward the barn. Dust rose with every movement, mixing with the smell of gunpowder. We worked in quiet rhythm. She picked her shots carefully, never wasting a round. My own shots kept them from rushing the porch. It didn't take long before the fight shifted. One man went down near the barn, another stumbled, clutching his leg. The rest hesitated, their shouts turning to curses. Kettering barked orders, but I could see the change they'd expected, an easy grab, not a stand. Finally, the marshal stepped out from cover, his hands raised. "Enough, Holt," he called. "We'll leave it here." His voice carried no promise, but I saw no point in dragging more blood into the dirt. I told him to take his men and not come back. He stared at Sokka a long moment before turning to his horse. They rode off smaller somehow than when they'd arrived. When the sound of hooves faded, the stillness returned. Sokka set her rifle aside and let out a breath she'd been holding. I knelt beside her, feeling the weight of what had just passed. She was safe for now, and that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, word spread through the valley. Folks came by with quiet nods, a sack of flour or a fresh-baked loaf. Nobody spoke too much about the fight, but everyone seemed to know what it meant. Lines had been drawn, and not everyone was willing to cross them. Spring came late that year, the hills greening slow under a soft sun. Sokka took to sitting on the porch in the afternoons, the wind in her hair, the quiet stretching between us like an old, comfortable quilt. Life would never be without its shadows, but we'd faced them and held our ground. Out here, justice isn't always handed down from a bench or a badge. Sometimes it's carved out of the dust by the folks who live on it. One choice, one stand, one promise kept at a time. If you've ever had to fight for your place or hold the line for someone who couldn't, you'll know what I mean. And if this story brought you something worth keeping, I hope you'll carry it with you and maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it.